So hello everyone, thanks for joining and welcome to this fourth session of Food Diversity Day. And in this session, the key thing we're going to be exploring is the role of farmed animals in driving diversity within our landscapes and society more broadly. We're going to hear about both animal foods that have become endangered, but also farming practices and ways of life. And above all, we're going to encourage a focus on the human and animal stories around the production of these foods, rather than the grand narratives that have taken hold in recent years, which often lack that ground-up understanding, which we're going to hear today. I'm Jimmy Woodrow, and I head up a non-profit organisation called Pasture for Life, which I hope some of you have heard of. We work to champion the restorative power of grazing animals on pasture and the positive role that pastured systems can play in planetary, animal, and human health. I wanted to start by saying today that we're focusing on animals in this session, but that shouldn't really distract from the fact that animals in both their farmed and wild forms have a supporting role in all the sessions today. Their ability to build fertility, to disrupt and generate biodiversity, and to be the converters of inedible plants into food that we can eat makes them essential players in a sustainable food system. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel brimming with experience, and we don't have long, so we're going to crack on. If you have ideas and questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them, but please forgive us if we don't. I'm going to go first to Frederick Lewis, Professor of Food Science and Biotechnology at the University of Brussels, and I don't think it's wrong to say that he's one of Europe's leading food systems thinkers. And Frederik, it's great to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I'll approach this wonderful topic of diversity through the lens of my own academic career, which started roughly, let's say, 25 years ago. And after a training in nutrition and food science and also engineering, and somewhat by coincidence, because of a specific research budget, I started to work on food fermentation, specifically on fermented meats. Think of salami as an example. And my objective as a food engineer back then was to correct problems that had been identified by the industry and had to do mostly with poor flavors and biosafety issues and so forth. And I find it interesting that I was dealing with one of the most controversial and probably the worst food group out there, processed meats, because they're part of the processed meats family, said to be bad for health, bad for the planet, bad for the animals. But then through my research, I've come to appreciate them as some of the most valuable foods we've ever eaten, and certainly among the most intriguing ones. And I don't say this to be contrarian. Of course, they're excellent sources of some key nutrients, that's one thing, but also they're among the most ancient foods, processed foods that are available to man. So we're talking before agriculture, before we started to ferment grains and produce dairy. So even for this, they do deserve our respect. So because in our ancestral past, we've heavily relied on that very productive constellation of humans and animals, whether they are hunted or as livestock, meat and microbes. So why the microbes? Well, here's the situation. So meat back then was vital for food security. Okay, so it was particularly valuable in difficult landscapes and in difficult climates. So think of the northern regions, think also of the ice ages and so on. But also meat spoils quickly. And imagine if you have a large carcass, which is way too much to eat, how inefficient it would be to just let that go to waste. Now, fortunately, when you place meat under specific appropriate conditions of temperature and humidity, mostly, beneficial microbes will spontaneously develop and they will act upon the meat. They will transform the meat. And what at first was perishable now becomes a stable food. It becomes a survival food. And how is that done? Well, microbes working together with the climate and working together with the meat chemistry. So what you see here on this slide is a recent study we performed on skelpikjøtt, which is sheep legs from the Faroe Islands. And we looked into the bacterial diversity. And it's not really a fermented meat, it's a ripened meat, but that's a technical discussion. But in any case, it's an amazing food. And it's one of the chapters also in the book of Dan. It makes perfect sense if you think about the Faroe Islands. So imagine those islands, think of the landscape, think of the climate, and especially of the fact that this is one of the only foods that would actually make sense in such a context. And that's what has been produced and consumed for generations in that region. So they place the leg in a kind of wooden shed, and the salty winds will blow through, and then they just give it time, right? So it's about place. It's very much about place. It's also about time, obviously, but it's also about empirical knowledge, about wisdom, about how to do this. And how does that connect to my initial problem of 25 years ago? Why would we need to have to look at even at such an ancient food to begin with? Well, that's because many things have changed, especially during the early to mid 20th century, in the way we keep animals, in the way we produce meat, and also fermented meats, obviously. And for fermented meat fermentation, instead of relying on the diversity of the microbes that you find on the meat and that come from the animal and from the environment, we now add purified starter cultures, and we inoculate them as a suspended powder to start a controlled and standardized fermentation process. And that's mostly, of course, from an economic rationale, which has advantages, obviously, but we seem to have lost something on the way. And that has to do with flavor, it has to do with complexity, and with notions of tradition. So my initial response as a food engineer was, let's just innovate our way out of this. So let's inoculate microbes that have higher metabolic potential, that are more powerful. So let's ramp it up, and we can maybe even source them in those traditional foods and use them in the mainstream products. But that got me thinking and brought me to a next problem, and that's the big question: what's innovation and what's tradition, for that matter? So it turns out that both concepts are very difficult to pin down. So, and they're also two sides of the same coin, because every tradition at some point in time was an innovation, right? And the reason why many, if not most, of the innovations we see today are frankly disappointing, or sometimes even monstrous, if you think about food from factories, this has little to do with technology or change as such. Of course, we need technology. That's one of our strongest assets as humans. We need those. But it has to do with a narrow vision on the food system. Because if you really want to recover traditional value, if you want to recover the real value, you'll need more than just a quick fix. You need more than just an optimized starter culture. So my initial paradigm here was a linear one. It was based on a reductionist view or approach to market problems, to market demand, which were driven by safety concerns and price and convenience, but in which products are seen as a commodity and are seen as a target for simplistic innovations. And the result of that is that you will end up with uniformity. Because of convergence to similar goals, you have people using similar ideas, similar process adaptations, and a complete abstraction of the broader context. And that context, of course, is social, it's cultural, it's ecological, it's historical, and in a way, of course, you could say that it's traditional. But that's why we cannot have a true discussion on diversity if we don't understand tradition, and good innovations will build on tradition. So it's quite important to understand tradition. What is tradition? Well, tradition is a complicated interaction between geography, time, know-how, skills, and meaning. So geography, time, know-how, and meaning, those are the dimensions of tradition. And diversity is really at the very heart of it all, because that's what emerges bottom up, locally, and contextually. And we really have to see traditions as the specific solutions you'll get and that have been developed over time to answer local problems of resources, but also to meet certain identities and needs in certain regions. So it's all about local landscapes. It's about the way they can carry animals. It's about the way those animals interact with those landscapes. About local breeds and genetics, about the diversity of the grasses and the various plants you'll find, and the soils on which those animals feed and those plants grow, the microbes in those soils, the way a huge diversity of phytonutrients will end up in animal muscle and fat, and then through this also in humans, and how all of this essentially is shaped by climate and by seasonality. So it's also about humans using their creativity to engage with those problems and to mobilize the resources and turn them into a variety of foods. So how do they consume those foods? In which kind of shared meal patterns will they consume them? During which moments, ordinary moments, or maybe celebrative moments? How do those foods interact with the microbial diversity in the gut? How do they shape health in that way? And that's really when you have the humans and the animals and the landscapes and the microbes, for that matter, come together in thoughtscapes, in the way we think about food, in different ways we think about food, and by doing so give it meaning. And there's if there's one thing that is missing in the current food system debate, or when we talk about innovation as well, it's a truly holistic discussion of thoughtscapes. It's therefore it's also about diversity, because diversity, and that's the last point I want to make, because diversity is a key driver, if not the most important driver, of resilience. And that's what it's really about, resilient food systems. In a context of change, when things are changing, and think of financial crisis, think of war, think of climate change, of course, it's only when you have a wide spectrum of possible solutions that you can face the future with confidence. And especially as options are being blocked out by the change. So it's the diversity that gives you the ways out and the ways forward. So, and that I think is probably our greatest challenge, is to think holistically, and even more so to think with difference, right? To use difference. And so when you think food, think difference, because there's a huge opportunity here. We can actually use food to stimulate a culture of difference and a culture of diversity. And I'll leave it with this, Jimmy. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederik. That's a brilliant introduction to everything we're going to hear in this session. And I want to ask you one quick question, which would tee us up nicely to talk to the farmers. I think, to me, it's very clear that you've had to diverge, perhaps, from mainstream scientific thinking, and you've outlined a bit of that. And I think this really echoes what a lot of farmers in this country are having to do at the same time. Move away from mainstream chemicals and farming practices. Can you elaborate on this and perhaps relate it to the current, often vicious media debates that are going on?
Yeah, absolutely. If it comes to animal farming, we're facing some extremely simplistic scenarios all the time, and it's laid out in mass media, but it's also coming from certain scientists. It's very often it's high tech, it's quick fix, and it's dogmatic, and I would say it's frightening. People look at the food system as if it were a video game, right, where you can just plug in and plug out certain things. And livestock agriculture being one of them. And it's often seen as one entity, as if all the animals would be the same, as if all farming systems would be similar, or even if all ruminants or all grasslands would all be a similar idea. So the proposals that come out of those circles, they would just, in my opinion, they would just narrow down our options rather than expand on what's possible. So they really underestimate the huge complexity of the whole food system and the actual solutions we have to find on the ground. Yeah,
thank you. So what I'm going to do now is to introduce you to both the farms we've got here, and to set the scene. I've got some pictures that they've sent me that I'm going to put up. So just briefly, Sam Beaumont farms in Cumbria at Gowbarrow Hall Farm, as well as consulting on nature restoration projects at Wilderculture. And we're also going to hear from Ellen and Leila Simon, who are second and third generation farmers at Tamarisk Farm, which is down on the Jurassic coast in Dorset. So Sam, over to you first.
Thanks, Jimmy. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. This is a picture of our farm. We're in the Lake District, so right next to Ullswater. I'm a southern boy. I moved here about 5 years ago because I fell in love and ventured north of the M4 corridor, which was a bit scary, a bit daunting. I think a lot of the local farmers probably were taking bets on how long I would last up here, but we're still here. Claire's granddad, my wife's granddad, bought this place about 30 years ago and farmed until he died. And sadly, Claire's uncle fell out of a tree and broke his back. So a lot of things happened, and some of the land was let to other farmers. But to cut a very long story short, really, we had to make some very big changes. We were struggling to make the economics work. We were not happy with the fertilizer we were using, the impact of the feed. And so we have radically changed our approach in the last sort of 3 years. And we are now, with a lot of help from people like Pasture for Life and a lady called Caroline Grindrod, who started a community interest company called Wilderculture. We're now running a very successful beef enterprise with about 75 head of shorthorn cattle. And we're doing beef boxes, direct sales. We're really trying to encourage diversity of grassland species, restoring species-rich meadows, but also encouraging wood pasture. We've also got a lovely little herd of pigs, and they also stay outside all year. Could you go to the next slide, Jimmy? And the pigs are a vital part of our ecosystem, I think. What they do in distributing seeds and opening up little pockets for regeneration is just really important. And this slide shows some of the habitats that we're working with. So we've got this ancient wood pasture that we're restoring, and the amount of species per square meter now is incredible. We've got orchids alongside kind of red clover and oak saplings, and it's quite exciting, really. So yeah,
brilliant.
That's me.
Thank you, Sam. And now moving down south to Ellen and Leila.
There we go. Hello, so I'm Leila. This is my mum, Ellen. We're on the coast of Dorset. My grandparents started the farm here in the 60s, and we've always been a fairly diverse farm. They've always had different livestock. There's always been vegetables and fruit, and there was arable at the beginning, and then there was a break, and we've got arable again now. We're currently at about 600 acres, 2/3 of which is National Trust land, and there's a large focus on that land and on our own of conservation, and our livestock are a key part of our tools to help maintain this and improve the biodiversity we've got going on as well. So we've got beef cattle. We have Red Devons, also known as North Devons or Ruby Reds, and they are a relatively small breed, but that works really nicely on our heavy clay. They aren't too heavy on the ground. We have 6 different breeds of sheep, which is fun to see in the field. We've got more commercial breeds like the Dorset Downs and the Jacobs, and then and just started with a handful of Romneys to see how they do on our land. And then we've got Hebridean Shetlands and Herdwicks, which grow slower, so they tend to be sold as hogget, slightly older than lamb. And we also utilize the mutton from our older sheep as well. We use the sheep for wool, so we've got knitting wool in over 20 different natural shades by blending them, and we do the sheepskins, and coming soon we will have fabric. We have chickens, which are primarily for their eggs. They're out on the pasture in our lovely little chicken caravan, so you can see there, Cluckingham and Hensington Palisons. And at the end of their life, we keep our hens for about 2 years, and then we have them processed and selling the carcasses as pot birds for slow cooking rather than nice plump fresh ones. We've still got a good market garden that's been running, and it's been doing well. and the arable we run as well. We do, at the moment, 6 different types of grain. Some of those are spring grains and some of those are winter. So we've got diversity in that as well. And peas as well. Yeah, that's kind of us. We're right on the coast, so we often have to move our animals along the beach to get from one part of the farm to another. And as I said, conservation is a big part of what we do here. One part of our farm we call the marsh is low-lying right on the back of the beach, and it's one of, if not the first, Dorset Wildlife Trust that was set up back in about 1962. And that, along with other small pockets of SSSI and areas which have been scrubby and never been ploughed up or anything, have been really good seed banks, allowing the plants and also animals like hares to spread out across our farm as a whole.
Yeah. And you see diversity when
You can say
I was only going to say the horse, it adds extra grazing diversity.
yes.
Which is helpful for all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Right, so I think we're actually slightly ahead of time. This is taking me a little bit by surprise. It's very good news. So we're just going to move now into the body of the discussion, which is going to be a bit of a structured conversation between all of us. And I wanted to just very quickly frame how we think about diversity at Pasture for Life, and I think a lot of people here on the panel will also feel the same, which is ultimately that all diversity in our food system comes from the soil. I'm sure we can all remember those pyramids from GCSE biology showing the different, the small organisms at the bottom of the pyramid working their way up to the apex predators at the top. And it's only really in the last few years that we've begun to realise as a food system that the living soil is really the foundation of this pyramid. So in this session, we're not doing a deep dive on soil, and we're not joined here by a soil expert, but everything you're going to hear will in some way really be a proxy for soil health. And we're going to start looking at this through plant diversity, which is really the above ground expression of soil health. And we're joined here by Dr. Elizabeth Cooke, who's a conservation advisor at the charity PlantLife, and PlantLife work to deliver lasting positive change for wildflowers, plants and fungi. And Lizzie, over to you. I'm going to share my screen again so you can have a few pictures in the background. There we go.
Oh, thanks. So species-rich grasslands like this one in Swaledale used to be a far more common feature of our landscapes. But we've seen massive declines in species-rich grasslands across the UK since the 1930s. Over 97% of the grasslands that used to be species-rich have now been agriculturally improved. So that's by the application of fertilizers, of re-sowing with more vigorous grasses, draining, or agricultural practices that are really productive, but they're less great for the rest of wildlife, for our wider and wider ecosystem services. So we're really championing species-rich grasslands. So that includes both sort of upland hay meadows like this one, lowland meadows, acid uplands like Sam was showing us, or this one's PlantLife Reserve in Herefordshire, where we've got more lowland meadow. And each of these different types of grasslands has its own plant communities. They're unique to different soil types. You get different meadow types, and that diverse tapestry of different grasslands across the UK is so fabulous. They're both just for their aesthetic value, but also for all the rest of the ecosystem services they provide. So as Jimmy mentioned about soil, grasslands store loads of carbon in their soil and at much greater depths than other habitats. So in woodlands, most of the carbon is in the above ground vegetation, and that can be at risk from tree diseases, from fires, from poor management, from chopping the trees down and burning them for firewood. Whereas in grasslands, although there's less carbon stored overall, most of it's stored in the soil and very securely. And it's just secured at a great depth, because the plant roots from all the different grassland plants, some are shallow rooting, some are deep rooting, and the different root architectures, different shapes of rooting patterns that you get mean you get carbon stored at depth. And also in more diverse grasslands, where you've got more diverse plant communities, that's we're starting to see how that's reflected in the soil fauna, that different plants, different grassland habitats have their own unique soil microbial communities or fungal communities that are associated with them. And there's a lot more research that needs to happen on that. But it's very exciting what we're seeing there. And so there's the carbon that these grasslands sequester. And then there's also many other ecosystem services to sort of water and air quality. But we only get all of these ecosystem services through herbivores, through livestock grazing. And livestock is essential for maintaining species diversity, because by grazing, they open up the sward, as Sam was mentioning earlier, which allows the establishment of new seedlings. So you can get annual species like, say, fairy flax or yellow rattle can be maintained within a sort of a grassland that's mainly got perennials in it. But without the grazing to create the disturbance and the bare patches, you wouldn't get the annual species in. So you get more niches in grasslands that are grazed than you would if you didn't have grazing. Livestock are also fabulous as a vector for dispersal to sort of help seeds move about and to establish new patches. And we've really lost that from the livestock farming practices in the UK. There used to be sheep droving that moved seeds about, cattle were moved between sites, whereas now our species-rich grasslands are just left in tiny parcels and they don't have that dispersal going on. And also different types of livestock graze in different ways. Cattle will wrap their tongue round bits of grass and then pull it out, whereas sheep close crop. So you get a sort of more of a lawn effect, and these different types of grazing benefit different plant species. So it's great to have, they help maintain diversity.
Just to be clear, Lizzie, we're not talking about just a green field here, are we? Lots of people will drive through the countryside, see a green field and think perhaps that's what we're looking for, but actually it's possibly not.
That's a very good point. Yes, often the grasslands, from a diversity point of view, the grasslands that look more brown are usually the ones that are more botanically interesting. Tends to be. So if it's bright green, that probably means it's had inorganic nitrogen applied to it, and you've got very lush, vigorous growth of a few sort of like ryegrass and other agricultural species. Whereas, if you haven't had that inorganic nitrogen applied, it doesn't look quite so bright green. And you can get grassland management on a whole spectrum, from sort of very intensively managed grassland through to SSI grasslands. But anything that moves you along the continuum from intensive management to sort of more relaxed, more sensitive management, it gives you many, many benefits, both for the soil, for the atmosphere, and for the other ecosystem services. So
Great, thank you. Sam, why are you restoring the species-rich, or a series of species-rich meadows on your farm? What's in it for you?
Yeah, so well, for us, it just seemed like there were so many benefits of having increased diversity that it just felt like an absolute no-brainer. So I mean, starting with the soil, as you've already mentioned, if we can increase the diversity of vegetation above ground, we're going to get differing rooting depths. We're going to get better minerals being kind of drawn up and kind of redistributed into the soil. And we're going to get better aggregated soil, which will hopefully absorb water better and hold water back and better. So we'll be more resilient in terms of, a drought or a flood type situation. And that will then have a knock-on effect into the cows. The cows themselves, their gut microbes will be more diverse because they've got more diverse vegetation to browse and forage on. and that will make them healthier, which then, as Frederik's already touched on, gets through into the food that we're producing. And so the food that we're producing will ultimately be a better product, and will help people be healthier if they eat it. There are also economic incentives. We've just started a higher tier stewardship scheme, so we're getting some funding to help restore the meadows, which is great. And we're doing quite a lot of plug planting this year. We've got 15,000 wildflower plug plants to put in the ground. Species like red clover, which is great protein for the cattle, and also sequesters nitrogen, so sort of helps to boost fertility. But we've also got things like knapweed, which traditionally is a weed, as the name suggests, but actually, the more I think about it, it's not a weed. There's no such thing as a weed in my book. I think these are all, the more diverse the more diverse vegetation you have, the better.
Just kind of briefly back to you, Lizzie. Are there any kind of specific schemes that you're doing at PlantLife to help the public get involved in this stuff? I mean, we're talking at the farm level here, but are there kind of public-facing opportunities? Oh, you're on mute.
Help if I would unmute myself, thank you. PlantLife, we've run an initiative called Nomo May, which come the spring, we're encouraging people to mow their lawns less often, to allow their lawns to grow up, or if you don't have a lawn, to encourage your local, whoever manages your local parks, your road verges, to just don't mow them quite so frequently, and then allow the flowers to grow up, and it looks a bit messier, but it also looks far more fabulously full of flowers. So do watch out for our social media for Nomo May. And then there's lots of advice on our website on grassland creation. And I think I'd also advocate, if anybody is a landowner with species-rich meadows, that you invite your local councillors or your MP to come and look at your farm and to just see what you're doing and see what benefits you can have, because it's really powerful seeing something in practice. So I think that's another great thing if you're a landowner you can do. And also just to support all of PlantLife's policy and advocacy work. We've been at COP15 recently, promoting grasslands and rangelands and savannas as part of the answer to, as part of the solution to the climate crisis. And we do a lot of other policy and advocacy work.
Great, thank you. I'm going to bring Leila and Ellen in here. And when we look at a species-rich meadow, what we're seeing is something, as Sam has alluded to, is quite specific to the field in which all these plants are growing. And I suppose if you take that thread through, bringing in what Frederik was saying earlier and some of the really fantastic things in Dan's book, what you have the potential for is a food that is really unique to that farm. How far does those sorts of ideas influence what you're doing down in Dorset?
It doesn't, in a sense, influence. That's not the reason we do it, but it is something which certainly has an effect. I mean, the thing which we find immensely satisfying is watching people who use the farm. We have quite a lot of public access, quite deliberately. We feel that one of the things about the flower-rich spaces we have and the beautiful regenerative stuff that's happening is that it's there for everybody to enjoy, as well as ourselves and as well as our animals to use it. And so we have people who connect through walking and enjoying it, and then coming and buying from us the meat and indeed the arable products as well, but the meat particularly in this context, where they've seen the whole pattern of what they've had, and there's nothing brought in. We haven't been strip mining somewhere else to feed our animals. They eat nothing but what's on the farm, what comes from the farm, and the people who live in the area and buy from us know what they're getting. They know very, very much what's there, what the benefits are besides the flavour of the food, which of course is excellent. But they have, as it were, an understanding of the whole, which I think is it's great satisfaction for us.
Great. I think now I want to move the conversation onto breeds, because obviously we're not just talking about plant diversity, we're talking about diversity within animal communities and genetic diversity. And much in the same way that we've lost huge amounts of crop diversity in the push to simplify and standardize our food system, this is also true in the key genetic lines within things like cattle, pigs, and chickens. You know, animals have been bred to grow much more quickly, often to the detriment of hardiness. And this has meant the marginalization of many of our native breeds in this country. And the Rare Breed Survival Trust, I think it's worth saying, was set up about 40 years ago to try and safeguard these breeds, and they're working through cataloguing and trying to halt the declines in these populations, which they are aiming to do with all of them by 2028. Sam, as you kind of pointed to in your initial kind of presentation, you've chosen a native breed that's not technically now at risk, the beef shorthorn, but that's not really the full picture, is it? Can you explain a little bit more about genetics within breeds?
Yeah, so that's right. So since the Second World War, beef shorthorn as a breed has sort of split off from traditional shorthorns to a kind of a dual purpose dairy and beef animal. Beef shorthorns split away. Quite a lot of continental and Canadian bloodlines were actually introduced to the breed, which kind of made them taller, have quite long legs, and just massive, actually, some of them now. And so what we want to do is to try and preserve the kind of traditional shorthorn, the sort of 1930s genetics, or even pre-1930s genetics. And so our bull is actually kind of resurrected, as it were, from genetics that go back to that date through AI and through careful kind of selection of genetics, because we actually want animals that are slightly smaller, deeper bodied. They just do better on pasture than some of these bigger animals. So,
and that, I mean, that story is definitely reflected across the farmers that I work with in Pasture for Life, and also across pretty much every breed that I'm aware of. People are selecting within breeds for the sort of genetics that suit their management style. And Sam, this also, I suppose, picks up on what you're doing with the pigs as well. You're using perhaps not something that's considered a native breed in this country, but it suits you. Can you talk a little?
That's right. Yeah. So we spent a long time trying to find a pig breed that wouldn't need supplementary feeding with grain, and it's quite difficult. We looked at all the native breeds, and I decided that they wouldn't really work sort of up here in Cumbria. So I looked at a breed called Cooke, which actually originates from New Zealand, but because there are no native pigs to New Zealand, people think that they're actually descended from pigs that were taken there by European settlers in the kind of 18th century or even before that, and kind of crossbred with a Vietnamese or Asian type pot-bellied pig. And so they're very, very hard, very fat. In fact, it means fat and round in Maori, Cooke. And so, yeah, they just do incredibly well. And we just need to give them a few apples a day, and the rest they just forage on what they can find, on things like acorns, beech mast, if they can get that, and they do really, really well on it.
And that point about not feeding grain to pigs, and this is also perhaps true of chickens, it's something we don't really hear talked of much, particularly in the media, but that's really where the grain that we're producing for animals is going to. You know, ruminants don't eat anywhere near as much as pigs and chickens do. So the idea that we've got genetics in pig populations that can survive without grain is really important. Just coming back to Tamarisk Farm now, and I think something that was very clear in your introduction was how many different things you're doing on your farm. Can you try and explain to the audience what that means and why it's important, and also perhaps thinking specifically about the role that the animals play in your vegetable production and your grain production?
Well, it means you never really get a holiday, because there's always something happening with one or other of the enterprises that you're doing. But it also means that you aren't reliant on a single cash crop, as it were. You know, we aren't just growing wheat, and if our wheat crop doesn't grow, then we haven't got anything. We aren't reliant on beef. And as Ellen remembers very well, with the BSE issue in the 90s, the beef prices just plummeted. But it was okay for us because the cull mutton price, the sheep prices, went up quite significantly.
Yeah, times 10. It wasn't just a little bit.
So having all these different enterprises really gives you sort of the stability in changing times, to be able to weather smaller scale problems. The animals are really important as part of the rotation on the arable. We take the sheep across the short-term lays, and they can eat the rich sort of. How many plants do you plant in those?
Well, when we talk about short-term lays, a lot of people talk about just ryegrass and maybe some red clover if you're lucky. We're talking about probably 10 species. Well, no, not 10 species, because we're probably talking about 3 grass species, and so lots of different plants even in that, which gives that depth in the soil that we were talking about, that Lizzie was talking about.
And then the sheep will graze those off, and when all of that comes out the other side of them, it's actually much more accessible nutrients for the soil and the plants again to then regrow. So that's really important with that. With the market garden, that has benefited hugely for over the last 50 or so years from having the manure from our overwintered indoor animals. So they come in for the winter mostly to protect the soil, because as I said earlier, we were on a very heavy clay. So we bring animals in for that. And the market garden has got some of the best soil on the farm, and that's been busy producing really good food, vegetables, for a long time for the local community.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. I mean, I think now there's a good opportunity here to close the loop and kind of bring us back to us humans. So, I mean, Frederik, bringing you back in, how does all this diversity that's happening on the farm, what does it mean for us, and what does it mean for our health, and perhaps our gut microbiome, as you alluded to earlier?
Yeah, well, I've worked in the past on the gut microbiome as well, did some gut studies, and I don't want to sound boring or repetitive, but the message is the same. It's complexity again, and it's about interactions. It's about cross-feeding mechanisms between the microbes. It's about webs of interrelated organisms, and very complicated biochemistry as well. So, and there's a parallel between ideas that gravitate around probiotics and starter cultures in the food fermentation industry, is where you single out a couple of microbes and you try to fix the system or your health using that narrow view on the complexity. So it's very much in agreement. Rather, in both scenarios, we have to acknowledge that there is a very complicated flux of microbes and phytochemicals at the same time also, and other molecules from the soil, as you said, all the way to the human, with different different shapes and configurations. But there's a diversity there that shows up through the entire food chain, ends up in our gut, and it affects and it shapes our health, but in ways we don't even understand yet. There's some preliminary research trying to link also like feed and nutrient density, or the abundance of certain phytochemicals in the food. Stefan van Vliet, for instance, is doing interesting work in that direction. But it's new science, and again, it comes back to the point of embracing the diversity here. And maybe what I want to stress as well still is that if we talk about diversity, and we talk about maximizing the benefits of that, we really have to factor in the animals as well, because it just it expands the picture, and they're a huge catalyst of diversity.
Thanks, Frederik. And unfortunately, everyone, we're going to have to bring this session to a close now. We've reached our 45 minutes. I feel like we could be going on this subject forever, and I'm sure that's also true of the other sessions. There are lots of strands we could have followed. To soften the blow, I would really encourage watching some of the other exciting talks to come this afternoon. I'm definitely going to be watching the one on cheese at 5 p.m, which to my mind, at its best, is the ultimate edible expression of farming, a landscape encapsulated in a food, if you like. And that's really our appeal to you watching. Keep animal foods in your diets, because the landscape needs them, your health needs them, and they offer one of the best ways to eat diversity. Whether it's a meadow, a rare breed, or soil microbiology, eat the landscape you want to see. Thank you to the panelists for their time and expertise, and thank you all for watching. See you soon.